Hello again, I'm Andy Vining, reading My Mother's Diaries. So, welcome back to Hiltonbury Farm in 1951. The year began with winter that had no intention of leaving quietly. The new year arrived beneath a thick blanket of snow, covering the fields, hedgerows, and lanes around Hiltonbury and turning the familiar countryside into something altogether different. It looked beautiful enough from the farmhouse windows, but beauty and farming do not always sit comfortably together. The chickens certainly had little appreciation for the scenery. Their arks in the front field had once again disappeared beneath drifts of snow, and one of the first jobs of the year was digging them out so they could be moved and cared for properly. It was hard work, cold work, the sort that left fingers numb and boots soaked through. But livestock paid no attention to holidays, weather, or calendars. They still needed feeding every day. Inside the farmhouse, there was no shortage of work either. While snow piled up outside, Mother battled mountains of ironing indoors, determined to start the year with some order, even if the weather seemed determined otherwise. My father, John, meanwhile, was not one to stay indoors for long. Even with snow on the ground, he found time to visit friends and neighbours. Farm life might have been demanding, making sure the cattle and other livestock all had drinking water, breaking the ice and thawing out the troughs, but winter evenings still brought opportunities for conversation, companionship, and the exchange of local news and gossip. At the beginning of January, the snow remained troublesome for several days. Roads were difficult and buses struggled through slushy lanes. But life carried on. One day I travelled into Southampton with John and young Andrew by bus because the roads were considered too treacherous for ordinary motoring. The city looked grey and cold beneath winter skies, but it was good to get out for a few hours before returning home for tea at Beechcroft. As always, no sooner had Christmas ended than thoughts turned towards the coming farming season. John was already planning ahead. He had purchased a new seed drill, a significant investment, and one that represented confidence in the year to come. Modern machinery is expensive and very difficult to come by, particularly in the post-war years when money would never stretch quite as far as one hoped. Yet a good farmer was always looking forward, always preparing for the next crop, and before the last memory of winter had faded. As if that were not enough excitement, John also ordered a new Ford car from Hendy's on the Bournemouth Road. The prospect of a new motor vehicle generated almost as much discussion as a good harvest. One of the highlights of those snowy days came when we all went tobogganing on the Camel's Hump. There was something wonderfully democratic about snow. Adults become children again, farmers forget machinery and livestock, children forget school. Everyone simply laughed, and laugh we did. We flew down the slopes on the Camel's Hump, slipping, sliding, and tumbling into snowbanks. And for a few precious hours, the worry of work, weather, and money seemed very far away indeed. Unfortunately, weather soon reminded us of its less pleasant side. Illness spread relentlessly through the family and friends. Jennifer developed a troublesome cough. Janet was laid low with chills. Heather became unwell, and before long it seemed as though every household we knew contained someone in bed. Then I succumbed myself. For several miserable days in mid-January I felt dreadful. I managed to struggle through essential jobs, cooking meals where necessary, but much of the time I could do little more than rest. Looking back, it seemed like bronchitis, influenza, and winter colds were sweeping through the country and the district like an invading army. At Beechcroft, poor Betty was seriously ill with bronchitis, and there were fears it might develop into pneumonia. Auntie Toss became weak after her own bout of illness. Mother was confined to bed, and even Uncle George and others were suffering. One could scarcely make a social call without discovering another invalid. Yet somehow life continued. The washing still had to be done. The children still needed looking after. Meals still had to appear on the table at the correct times. And the cows, of course, still needed milking every day, morning and night. And no matter how sickness laid so many of us low, we soldiered on. And the endless mending, darning and sewing seemed to multiply whenever illness struck. Much of January was spent balancing household duties with concern for friends and family. I walked to Beechcroft regularly to check on the invalids, carrying news one way and bringing updates back the other. Among the more worrying stories was that of Les Beaton. Poor Les was suffered from severe exhaustion and depression, and he suffered a nervous breakdown. The strain of his work and business had clearly taken a toll on him. Happily, as the days passed, signs of improvement began to appear, and by mid-month he was recovering steadily. And by the end of January he seemed much more like his old self. Meanwhile, life at Hiltonbury carried on with its familiar rhythm. Wash day followed ironing day. Kitchen cupboards were reorganised. New cabinets arrived, floors were scrubbed, and the piano tuner paid a visit. Plumbing work began upstairs in the lavatory and the bathroom to fix the piping there. But there was always another job waiting. Yet somehow there was still time for enjoyment. The village hall dancing classes continued to flourish. They had become one of the great social events of local life. On cold winter evenings, neighbours gathered to dance, laugh, and forget their troubles for a while. And I always enjoyed those sessions. The hall always seemed to glow with warmth and companionship, particularly when the darkness settled early outside. And then there was football. John remained a devoted supporter of Southampton, and whenever possible he took Andrew with him to the Dells to see the Saints. Those trips became treasured father and son outings. One can imagine them setting off on a cold Saturday afternoon, wrapped against the weather, joining thousands of others as Southampton battled through another season. The football itself was important, of course, but perhaps even more important was the shared experience. For Andrew, these journeys must have felt like great adventures to the Dell. They were picked up at the end of the farm drive by Harry Jones's coaches from Hursley, and once at the ground, John lifted him over the turnstiles, and he had a seat in the upper stands on the halfway line, a very good seat indeed, and everyone squeezed up to make room for Andrew. January also brought happier family occasions. Heather celebrated her birthday on the 19th, and as always, preparations began well in advance. Cakes had to be baked and iced properly, friends were invited, tea was organised, and Hiltonbury Farmhouse filled with the happy noise of happy children. Saturday, the 29th, we went into Southampton for a trip to see Toad of Toad Hall. It was thoroughly entertaining and provided a welcome escape from our winter worries. The month ended with signs that the worst of the weather might finally be loosening its grip. Snowdrops were beginning to appear, these tiny white flowers pushing bravely through the cold ground. They were easy to overlook to start, but to country people they carry an important message. Spring was coming, not yet, but soon. And then February arrived with rain, wind and mud. The snow had largely disappeared, but winter was far from finished. The social calendar, however, showed no sign of slowing down. There were quizzes, dances, suppers and parties in abundance. The Gromore Club remained a central feature of farming life. Its quizzes generated friendly competition and provided endless amusement, and one evening we competed against the local Women's Institute in a mixed quiz contest at the Clock Inn at Fair Oak. The result hardly mattered. The laughter certainly did, and we had a lovely time. Soon afterwards came the final in Winchester, another occasion combining rivalry with good humour, and Fair Oak Gromore Club won. What great celebrations there was. Village life depended upon such events. People worked hard and they appreciated opportunities to enjoy themselves. Then, February the 6th also brought Jennifer's birthday. The preparations were extensive. Ice cream had to be obtained, food organised, guests invited, transport arranged, and the party itself proved a tremendous success, with 13 young guests filling the house with excitement and noise. By the end, I was exhausted but delighted, and Jennifer had had a lovely time. The children continued to have their own adventures. Jennifer was often riding Smoky, her pony, a great deal, and one of the delights was hearing about her various outings. She attended hunting meets and regularly went out on Smoky whenever the weather allowed. The snowdrops, meanwhile, becoming serious business. What began as a few flowers soon became an operation. 40 bunches one day. A couple of days later, 120 bunches. Then a couple of more days and 138 bunches. The family seemed constantly engaged in picking, sorting and bunching snowdrops. The children helped, friends helped, visitors helped. Buckets and baskets of flowers were everywhere. As February went on, the snowdrop harvest had become a major occupation, and the shops in the village could not seem to get enough of them. Then one evening, John and Winnie Dean and I went to the pictures where we watched All About Eve. It was a marvellous film with Betty Davis, Anne Baxter, George Sanders and Marilyn Monroe. It really was a great film. And then came the great highlight of the winter, the N.F.U, the National Farmers Union Ball in Winchester. The evening itself was everything one hoped for: music, dancing, laughter and conversation. Farmers and their wives enjoying a rare opportunity to leave fields and livestock behind for a few hours. And then came the big surprise. I won a pig in the raffle, a real pig denoted by one of the farmers, not a toy, not a joke, an actual pig. The absurdity of it delighted everyone and became a talking point for weeks, and certainly when it was a great addition to the farm when it arrived a couple of days later. Only in farming circles could such a prize be greeted with equal measures of laughter, envy, and practical calculations. Towards the end of February, another pleasant adventure arrived. Bet and Fred invited us to Beaconsfield in Berkshire, and we had our drive up there in John's new car, and that itself felt like a holiday. Upon arrival, we enjoyed eggs and bacon for supper and spent a long evening chatting in the warmth of their kitchen. The following day brought shopping expeditions, sightseeing, and I even purchased myself a new pair of lovely shoes. It was a wonderfully relaxing break from the endless routine of farm and household responsibilities. And then when we returned home after the weekend, we were so pleased to discover that everything had run smoothly during our absence. Back at Hiltonbury, signs of spring continued to multiply. One particularly exciting development involved the arrival of young chicks. Mr. Cross had been caring for them in his greenhouse, and everyone was eager to see them. By the time I visited them, they were thriving, tiny bundles of yellow fluff, cheeping constantly and full of life. To outsiders, they probably looked insignificant. To a farming family like ours, they represented the future: eggs, income, growth, and another season beginning. And perhaps that is the real story of these 2 months. January began buried in snow, fields frozen, families ill, days short and dark. Yet little by little, the world changed. Snowdrops emerged, children recovered, friends regained their health, new machinery stood ready to go. The chicks arrived, plans were made, the days lengthened, and everywhere one looked there were signs that winter's hold was weakening. As February drew to its close, I found myself looking ahead rather than behind. There would soon be spring drilling, longer evenings, new growth, new opportunities. The farm, like the seasons themselves, was preparing to begin again. And so, as winter finally started to loosen its grip on Hiltonbury Farm, we close another chapter and look forward to whatever the spring of 1951 might bring. For, on a farm, no matter how hard the winter, there is always another season waiting just beyond the horizon. Thank you for listening to my mother's diaries.